Crowded living before modern housing is usually explained in simple terms. There were too many people and not enough space. Cities attracted labor. Work required proximity. Walls were expensive, so families compressed themselves into rooms not designed for permanence. It appears inefficient, uncomfortable, and predictable, but the explanation is incomplete. Rural cottages were also crowded. So were fishing villages. So were farmsteads during winter. Even where land was available, interior space remained tight. If crowding were only a problem of land scarcity, it would have disappeared the moment fields widened. It did not. The common belief is that people endured density because they had no alternative. Yet in many cases, they built houses themselves. They determined the number of rooms. They chose how additions were made. And still, they kept building inward rather than outward. Something else was operating, something less visible than walls. Consider a typical pre-modern household. A dwelling was not merely shelter. It was workshop, storage site, kitchen, stable, sleeping quarters, and social unit. Heat came from a single source, light from a single opening. To separate space was to divide warmth, labor, and supervision. Privacy, as we understand it, required additional fuel, additional structure, additional time. But even this does not fully account for the persistence of crowding. If the issue were only heat efficiency, warmer regions would have expanded differently. Many did not. If it were only poverty, wealthier households would have dispersed internally. Often they did not. Servants slept near masters, apprentices near craftsmen, children near parents long after physical space allowed separation. The arrangement was not temporary. It was structural. Crowding was not simply endured, it was organized. At first glance, proximity appears to be a byproduct of hardship, yet it functioned as something else, something stabilizing. In a world without external monitoring, without formal enforcement beyond the immediate community, constant visibility replaced locks. When walls were thin and bodies were near, behavior could not drift far from expectation. It created a form of stability that did not rely on consent. It also created pressure. If everyone is always observed, where does deviation go? The question is not why people lived close together. The question is what that closeness prevented, and what it quietly produced instead. To understand crowded living, it is necessary to step backward, not into architecture, but into obligation. Before modern housing, a household was not defined by affection or preference. It was defined by function. The word family often meant something closer to a labor unit than a private circle. Blood relatives, apprentices, widows, distant cousins, hired hands, all were absorbed into a single interior. Space was not arranged for comfort. It was arranged for continuity. A house operated like a field in winter. Nothing unnecessary was left exposed. Everything that could be consolidated was consolidated. Grain was stored tightly to prevent rot. Animals were brought inside to preserve warmth. People followed the same logic. Distance introduced risk. If a tool went missing, proximity revealed it. If a fire weakened, someone nearby corrected it. If a child wandered, eyes were already present. Crowding narrowed the range of what could happen, and uncertainty, in a pre-modern world, was more dangerous than discomfort. But proximity did more than reduce risk. It redistributed authority. In a single-room dwelling, hierarchy had no private corridors. Decisions were witnessed. Disputes were overheard. Correction was immediate. A father did not need to summon a child from another wing. A master did not need to search for an apprentice. Instruction occurred within reach. The arrangement made disobedience visible before it became defiance. This is often mistaken for simplicity, a quaint closeness of earlier times. It was not sentimental. It was regulatory. Imagine a loom placed in the center of a room. Every thread passes through tension before it forms cloth. The household functioned in the same way. Individuals passed constantly through shared space. Friction was not accidental, it was structural. And yet friction accumulates. When labor fills the daylight hours, proximity is tolerable. Work absorbs strain. But at night, when movement slows and conversation replaces motion, space does not expand. Bodies remain within reach. Breath remains audible. Sleep occurs in shifts of awareness, rather than isolation. There was no language for exhaustion caused by presence. No term for the fatigue of perpetual observation. It was simply life. But systems built to prevent deviation often suppress release as well. If distance never forms, where does solitude occur? If solitude does not occur, where does private thought settle? Crowded living preserved order. It minimized unpredictability. It stabilized labor. Yet the same mechanism that reduced risk also removed separation. And without separation, something else began to accumulate. Slowly, invisibly, without being named. Once proximity proved effective, it did not remain confined to the household. It scaled. As towns expanded, the logic of compression followed them. Workshops leaned into living quarters. Upper floors were divided again and again. Beds were shared not only by siblings but by shifts of laborers whose working hours did not overlap. Space became rotational. It followed a logic that did not appear disorderly. A landlord who divided a room into 3 sleeping areas did not believe he was creating strain. He was increasing yield. A master who housed additional apprentices beneath his own roof was not seeking control for its own sake. He was securing labor continuity. Parents who delayed the departure of grown children were not resisting independence. They were protecting stability. Each decision made sense in isolation. Proximity reduced heating costs. It reduced construction materials. It reduced theft. It reduced idleness. It increased oversight. It increased output. It increased survivability during illness, since someone was always present to tend the fire or fetch water. But repetition transforms practice into norm. When enough households compressed themselves, distance itself became unusual. A separate sleeping room suggested surplus. Surplus invited scrutiny. In communities calibrated around shared endurance, visible excess altered perception. So expansion slowed not only for economic reasons, but for social ones. Density became expectation. Consider how livestock were housed in winter, close enough that their heat benefited one another, separated only by low barriers that discouraged injury without sacrificing warmth. Human interiors adopted a similar compromise. Enough division to prevent conflict from escalating, not enough to isolate. It appeared balanced. Yet balance in one direction creates imbalance elsewhere. As towns grew denser, trades specialized. Bakers rose before dawn. Tanners worked late to manage odor. Weavers required steady rhythm. Noise patterns shifted, but walls did not thicken proportionally. What had once been shared routine became overlapping routines. Sleep fragmented, not catastrophically, not dramatically, gradually. Children learned to rest amid movement. Adults learned to ignore conversation not meant for them. The body adjusted to interruption as background condition rather than event. Adjustment is often mistaken for resilience, but adaptation has cost. When households are structured around continuous visibility, deviation is suppressed early. When communities are structured around continuous compression, variation narrows. Innovation requires space, not intellectual abstraction, but physical distance in which deviation is not immediately corrected. If every action is within reach of response, experimentation shortens. Crowded living did not forbid change, it filtered it, and over time, filtering alters what survives. The system had increased efficiency, preserved warmth, stabilized labor, and reduced risk. But it had also begun to reshape the range of possible behavior. At what point does stabilization become containment? Containment rarely announces itself. For generations, compression appeared to work. Towns grew, trades multiplied, markets stabilized. The household remained the center of production and supervision. Density seemed compatible with prosperity. Then pressures accumulated from directions the structure had not anticipated. Seasonal illness had always moved through communities. That was expected. What changed was duration. When sleeping bodies were separated by little more than fabric or habit, recovery depended not only on the strength of the ill, but on the endurance of everyone nearby. An infection did not encounter distance. It encountered sequence. One worker fell ill. Another absorbed the labor. The second weakened. A third compensated. The pattern did not break because separation was limited. The system had been designed to eliminate gaps. It succeeded. What had once ensured continuity began to carry something it had not been designed to contain. This was not understood as architecture. It was understood as misfortune. In growing towns, new arrivals required lodging. Houses extended upward. Cellars were converted. Internal partitions multiplied without altering airflow. Windows remained small to preserve heat and security. Streets narrowed as buildings leaned toward one another. Fresh air became seasonal rather than constant. No one intended to trap it, yet it lingered. Consider how grain spoils when stored too tightly in damp conditions. The first kernels appear intact. The loss becomes visible only after accumulation. Interiors functioned similarly. Air circulated just enough to maintain habit, not enough to disperse concentration. Authorities, where they existed, responded with familiar tools: curfews, closures, prayer, market restrictions. These addressed movement across space. They did not address space itself, because space had never been considered a variable. The household remained the unquestioned unit of order. To divide it further seemed impractical. To thin, it seemed wasteful. Labor still required proximity. Fuel still required consolidation. Security still required visibility. So, compression continued. But something subtle had shifted. Earlier, crowding had stabilized behavior. Now it began to stabilize exposure. Children who might have survived isolated illness encountered it repeatedly. Apprentices who might have recovered fully returned to work in partially ventilated rooms. Sleep, already fragmented by overlapping routines, shortened further when coughing replaced conversation. Productivity did not collapse at once. It declined in increments. When decline is gradual, it invites explanation through character rather than structure. People were described as weaker. Seasons were described as harsher. Morality was occasionally blamed. The walls were not. And yet the walls had quietly reorganized consequence. If proximity could no longer distinguish between supervision and transmission, what remained of its advantage? By the time separation became desirable, it had already become disruptive. The household had long functioned as the smallest reliable system, a contained cycle of heat, labor, supervision, and inheritance. To divide it meant altering all four at once. Fewer bodies in a room required more fuel. More rooms required more material. More walls reduced oversight. Reduced oversight altered behavior. So change arrived unevenly. In parts of Europe, after recurring waves of plague, population decline briefly created space. Survivors occupied dwellings once shared by many. Wages rose. Rooms expanded. For a moment, compression loosened, not by design, but by absence. The shift did not originate in architectural theory. It followed demographic rupture. Later, in expanding cities such as London and Paris, reformers began to notice patterns that earlier generations had normalized. Mortality clustered in narrow courts. Illness lingered in subdivided interiors. Reports described dwellings where multiple families rotated through the same air. These observations did not immediately dismantle the system. They competed with it. Land within city walls remained finite. Guild structures preserved proximity between master and apprentice. Markets required density to function. The logic that had once stabilized survival continued to stabilize profit. Only when walls were breached, physically, as cities expanded beyond medieval boundaries, did alternatives become feasible. Wider streets allowed airflow. Detached houses reduced shared surfaces. Internal rooms acquired specialized functions rather than rotational use. Separation, once inefficient, became protective. But the transition carried its own cost. Extended households fractured. Apprentices lodged elsewhere. Servants slept apart. Observation thinned. Authority dispersed. The old interior discipline weakened as space widened. Crowded living had suppressed deviation and amplified transmission. Expanded living reduced transmission and permitted deviation. In hindsight, the pattern appears consistent. Where proximity solved the immediate problems of heat, labor, and supervision, it quietly accumulated biological and behavioral consequence. Where separation reduced those consequences, it redistributed control and cost. No single decision created the crowded interior. No single reform dissolved it. The structure emerged from reasonable choices repeated across generations, each optimizing for survival under visible constraints. The hidden cost was not discomfort. It was embedded in the design itself, only becoming visible when its regulation began to reverse. Once the outcome is visible, it seems inevitable. Before it was visible, it seemed practical.